Slavery, where people are treated as property and stripped of their personal rights, has existed in various forms around the world. However, one particular system stands out due to its vast scale and enduring impact: the Atlantic slave trade. The numbers involved are staggering. Between 1500 and 1880 CE, an estimated 10 to 12 million African slaves were forcibly taken from Africa to the Americas, with about 15% dying during the journey. Most of the enslaved Africans came from 6 main regions: Senegambia, Sierra Leone, and the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa, also known as Congo and Angola. Approximately 12.4 million people were packed onto slave ships and transported across the Atlantic through what became known as the Middle Passage, heading to various destinations. Once they arrived in the Americas, the surviving slaves were sold at markets similar to livestock auctions. After being bought, slave owners would often brand their new property on the cheeks, much like cattle. The lives of these slaves were dominated by relentless work and constant fear. They were dehumanized, seen as soulless beasts to be branded, burned, and treated with extreme cruelty, with no hope for justice or recourse. The history of humanity is marked by oppression, dominance, war, and slavery. Since ancient times, people around the world have forced others into bondage. The Atlantic slave trade is a particularly harrowing chapter, involving millions of Africans torn from their communities by European slave traders and shipped across the Atlantic under brutal conditions. In the early 1500s, Portugal and Spain began conquering and establishing colonies in the New World, coercing the indigenous people to work on their plantations. However, the combination of European diseases and the violence of conquest led to the deaths of many Native American slaves, creating a labor shortage. To address this, Europeans turned to Africa. As voyages to Africa continued, driven by numerous expeditions by Portuguese and Spanish explorers, the transatlantic slave trade began to take shape. Africa became a significant source of slaves for Europe, the Spanish West Indies, and Portuguese colonies in Brazil. Over time, African slaves replaced the indigenous Indian slaves who had succumbed to European diseases and conquest. Referring to these Africans merely as slaves is a disservice to their true identities. Before their capture by Europeans, many were farmers, merchants, soldiers, musicians, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, and more. They were husbands, fathers, wives, children, and mothers with rich origins and heritage. However, when Europeans invaded their communities, these individuals were stripped of their identities and forced into captivity. They were boarded onto large ships and taken to Europe, where they were scattered across the Americas and various parts of Europe. Under their new captors, they endured appalling conditions, subjected to brutal labor and severe punishment. They were stripped, flogged, and made to work grueling hours in harsh weather and health conditions. The transatlantic slave trade transported between 10 million and 12 million enslaved Black Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. You might have heard of the triangular trade and how Africa was a major part of this trade, suffering economically while the other 2 parts of the triangle enjoy huge economic benefits. We'll get to that shortly. The first slave voyage from Africa to the Americas is believed to have sailed in 1526. Even before this period, Africans were bought as slaves directly from Europe, and native inhabitants of America were also enslaved by European explorers. Before 1518, the Spanish monarchy didn't permit the transportation of African slaves from Africa. This was not due to a sense of moral value or humanity, but because they believed Africans were barbaric and would corrupt European society by introducing pagan and non-Christian practices. However, over the years, economic reasons led to a change in this decision. On August 18, 1518, King Charles V granted a charter to Lorenzo de Corovat to transport 4,000 slaves directly from Africa to the Spanish-American colonies. Over time, King Charles changed the law established by his grandparents, permitting slaves to be brought into Spanish colonies in America from Africa on the condition that they would be converted to Christianity during their voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. With this new decree in place, there was an explosion in the number of slaves moved from Africa to America. There was an immediate expansion of the slave trade in the Western Hemisphere. European slave traders gathered and imprisoned the enslaved at forts on the African coast and then transported them to the Americas. Generally, European slave traders did not participate in the raids because their life expectancy in sub-Saharan Africa was less than a year due to widespread malaria infection. Consequently, most people transported in the transatlantic slave trade were from Central and West Africa, captured by other West Africans and sold to Western European slave traders. The transatlantic slave trade was essential to the economics of the triangular trade route. European colonies in America needed the supply of slaves for their plantations. Speaking of essential, it's essential for you to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. They don't want us sharing stories like this, but we're going to continue anyway with your support. Now, let's dive a little deeper into the triangular trade route. This trade structure operated across the Atlantic region and involved three key stages. The first side of the triangle involved taking goods from Europe to Africa, including arms, textiles, and wine. The second side was the movement of African slaves to the Americas and the West Indies. The final side of the triangle was the transport of raw materials such as sugar, coffee, tobacco, rice, and cotton produced on American plantations back to Europe. In this triangular system, Europe provided the capital, Africa supplied the labor, and America offered the land and resources. There was always a steady supply to the European market. The story of the transatlantic slave trade is intertwined with the stories of all people across these three continents, but is especially poignant for those who endured the Middle Passage voyage. This trade route transported slaves and was notorious for its brutality and high mortality rates. The voyage, depending on the weather, could last anywhere from 3 to 6 months. Conditions were so harsh that not only did many slaves perish, but crew members also faced significant mortality rates, with approximately 20% of sailors losing their lives. Ships used for the Middle Passage were specifically designed and varied in size and passenger capacity, but they all shared inhumane conditions. African slaves were confined below deck in cramped quarters, with minimal opportunity to be out in the sunlight. They were forced to engage in enforced exercises, such as dancing, to ensure they were healthy and in good physical condition upon arrival in Europe. These measures were taken purely to maximize profit, with little regard for the well-being of the enslaved individuals. Inside these decks, the conditions were appalling. The air was sticky and thick with the stench of filth, excrement, and urine. According to research from 1794, the space allotted for each person was incredibly cramped. Men had just 6 feet by 1 foot 4 inches, women had 5 feet by 1 foot 4 inches, and girls had 4 feet 6 inches by 1 foot. The air was hot, stale, and permeated with the constant smell of dirt and human waste. The enslaved suffered from severe starvation and thirst, receiving only 24 ounces of water per day, roughly equivalent to 2 12-ounce soda cans. Their primary food consisted of horse beans and rice. Packed tightly in tiers below decks, they were chained together by their hands and feet. The journey was fraught with numerous challenges. Epidemic diseases and attacks by pirates were common, as were physical, sexual, and psychological abuse by slave traders and crewmen. Historians estimate that between 15 and 25% of the enslaved Africans bound for the Americas perished during the voyage. Conditions were so dire that only a small fraction of the Africans transported in the slave trade came directly to North America, about 4% or fewer than 400,000 individuals. The vast majority were sent to the Caribbean and South America, with almost half, around 5 million, transported to Brazil. You might wonder why thousands of slaves couldn't overpower the hundreds of crewmen. The reality was that the enslaved individuals were often weakened by disease, starvation, and the brutal conditions of their confinement. They were also kept in a state of fear and disorientation, and any attempts at rebellion were met with swift and ruthless punishment. It's true that there were instances of African slaves revolting and seizing control of their ships, which is both chilling and fascinating. However, it's important to note that slave traders were typically armed and had the slaves in chains before and during transport. Now, let's wrap up our discussion on the journey and economics of the transatlantic slave trade. While we might assume that all slaves transported out of Africa were part of the transatlantic route, that's not entirely accurate. The transatlantic slave trade only accounted for about half of the total slaves traded out of Africa. From approximately 650 AD to 1900 AD, Islamic traders also played a significant role, exporting an estimated 10 million slaves to regions such as Arabia, Yemen, Iran, India, and Iraq. These slaves were transported across the Sahara Desert, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. While some remained enslaved within Africa, many were sent to distant lands. In West Africa, particularly along the Gulf of Guinea, slave activities were so extensive that the region, including present-day Togo, Benin, and Nigeria, became known as the Slave Coast. Initially, Portuguese traders captured Africans as slaves during tribal conflicts. As demand increased, they ventured deeper into Africa, forcibly taken captives. By the 1690s, approximately 30,000 Africans were being taken out of Africa annually. By the 1700s to 1850s, this number rose to about 85,000 per year. During this period, it's estimated that more than 8 out of 10 Africans forced into slavery successfully crossed the Atlantic. Between 1821 and 1830 alone, around 80,000 Africans were leaving Africa yearly. In the 2 decades leading up to the abolition of the slave trade, over 1 million more Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic to the Americas. By 1820, nearly 4 Africans had been transported across the Atlantic for every European, highlighting the scale of the transatlantic slave trade. Moreover, 4 out of 5 women who made this journey were from Africa. The majority of enslaved Africans brought to British North America arrived between 1720 and 1780. Those sent to Brazil primarily hailed from Angola, while those transported to North America and the Caribbean were predominantly from West Africa. Despite only about 6% of African captives being sent to British North America by 1825, the U.S. population already included about 1/4 of people of African descent in the Western Hemisphere. Interestingly, slavery in America differed significantly from its conditions in Europe. But before delving into these details, let's discuss the Revolt of 1839. As mentioned earlier, in 1839, slave traders anticipated another shipment across the Atlantic. However, they were unprepared for what awaited them on this particular voyage of the slave ship Amistad. Carrying about 100 recently abducted Africans near the coast of Cuba, approximately 53 unwilling passengers led by Joseph Cinque staged a violent revolt. They killed the captain and cook but spared the Spanish navigator to sail them back to Sierra Leone. The navigator veered northward, and 2 months later, the U.S. Navy intercepted and seized the Amistad off Long Island, New York. The ship was towed to New London, Connecticut, where the mutineers were imprisoned in New Haven. This event had profound political and legal consequences for the American abolition movement. The Spanish embassy demanded the return of the African slaves to Cuba, leading to a landmark 1840 trial in Hartford, Connecticut, federal court. New England abolitionist Lewis Tappan successfully garnered public sympathy for the Africans and fiercely opposed the pro-slavery U.S. government. Despite these efforts, U.S. President Martin Van Buren ordered a Navy ship sent to Connecticut to swiftly return the Africans to Cuba. After the trial, the legal proceedings took an intriguing turn. Prosecutors argued that as slaves, the mutineers were subject to laws governing the conduct between slaves and their masters. However, a pivotal revelation emerged during the trial. While slavery itself was legal in Cuba, the importation of slaves from Africa was not. This critical distinction led the judge to rule that the Africans aboard the Amistad were not commodities but victims of kidnapping, thereby justified in their actions to escape captivity by any means necessary. When the U.S. government appealed the case to the Supreme Court the following year, former President John Quincy Adams successfully argued for the Amistad rebels. The Supreme Court upheld the lower court's decision. Through contributions from private and missionary societies, the 35 surviving Africans secured passage home, arriving in Sierra Leone in January 1842. Accompanying them were 5 missionaries and teachers who later established a Christian mission in the country. While Europeans bear significant responsibility for the Atlantic slave trade, it's crucial to recognize that Africans were also involved. Africans engaged in kidnapping adults and capturing children for sale, often facilitated by European intermediaries who traded goods or weapons for captives. Many of those enslaved were from different ethnic groups than those who captured them, stripped of their identities and viewed simply as commodities. Some were criminals or prisoners sold into slavery as a form of punishment or expulsion from their communities. Raids at gunpoint organized by various African ethnic groups, sometimes in collaboration with Europeans, also contributed to the capture of slaves. Additionally, on the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana, Africans participated in the slave trade through intermarriage with Europeans. Known as Kasari, derived from Portuguese, these marriages formed political and economic alliances between slave traders and Europeans in the early stages of the trade. These complexities illustrate that the history of slavery involves multifaceted dynamics and collaborations across continents, challenging simplistic narratives of victimhood and culpability. It was a common practice for powerful West African families to arrange marriages between their women and European traders, strengthening alliances and facilitating trade. While these marriages followed African customs, Europeans raised no objections, recognizing their importance for business success. Initially, some may argue that Africans were unaware of the full extent and consequences of the slave trade. However, according to Robin Law, the royal elites of the Dahomey Kingdom likely had an informed understanding. Diplomats sent by the Dahomey king to Brazil and Portugal returned with detailed accounts, and some elites had first-hand experience of slavery in America. The Dahomey Kingdom opposed the enslavement of fellow Dahomeans under penalty of death, but did not oppose the institution of slavery itself. On the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana, elites actively engaged with Europeans to learn about and participate in the slave trade. They sent their children to live in European forts, and some even sent them to Europe and America for education. Elites on the Gold Coast also had agreements with Dutch and British governments to rescue individuals tricked into slavery in America. Despite these engagements, many Africans who were not fully informed about the Atlantic slave trade believed rumors that Europeans were cannibals planning to cook and eat their captives. This misconception added to the distress of those enslaved and transported across the Atlantic. The transatlantic slave trade resulted in countless deaths both during transportation and upon arrival in the Americas. Reports suggest that over 1 million people died during the voyage to the New World, with many more perishing soon after arrival due to harsh conditions. The exact number who died upon arrival as slaves is unclear, but likely exceeded those who survived enslavement. Overall, the Atlantic slave trade inflicted immense suffering, devastating lives and cultures. An estimated 12 million slaves entered the Atlantic trade between the 16th and 19th centuries, with approximately 1.5 million dying on board slave ships. The estimated deaths of many Africans during slave raids and wars in Africa have been termed a genocide by Canadian scholar Adam Jones, describing it as one of the worst holocausts in human history. While some argue these deaths were unintended and that slave owners had an interest in keeping slaves alive for labor exploitation, Jones contends that the killing and destruction were intentional if an institution knowingly perpetuates such harm on a specific group. Saidiya Hartman, an American scholar focusing on African American studies, offers a contrasting view. She argues that the deaths of enslaved people were incidental to profit acquisition and the rise of capitalism. Hartman posits that these deaths were not a primary goal, but rather an unavoidable consequence of commerce, where the normative value of human life was diminished. Unlike the intentional extermination seen in concentration camps or gulags, Hartman suggests that in the Atlantic slave trade, mass death was a byproduct of treating human beings as mere commodities. When assigning blame for the Atlantic slave trade, it's important to recognize that 7 nations played significant roles: Portuguese, British, French, Spanish, Dutch, American, and Danish. These nations transported the majority of enslaved Africans to their colonies in the New World from regions such as Angola, Benin, Biafra, Gold Coast, Senegambia, Southeast Africa, Indian Ocean Islands, Sierra Leone, and the Windward Coast. The presence of European slavers also influenced African legal codes, with some societies changing punishments for crimes to include enslavement and selling offenders to slave traders. While scholars like Adam Jones view the deaths during the Atlantic slave trade as a deliberate genocide due to institutional perpetuation, Saidiya Hartman presents an argument that frames these deaths as incidental to the profit-driven system of commerce and capitalism, where human life held little normative value. The involvement of multiple European nations and the impact on African societies' legal systems further complicates the historical and moral implications of the Atlantic slave trade. David Stannard, author of American Holocaust, emphasizes in his work that a significant portion of African deaths occurred within Africa itself due to warfare between native kingdoms, which often resulted in the enslavement of captured enemies and their communities. This practice was widespread in West Africa and served multiple purposes: financing future conflicts, removing potential dissenters, and profiting from the sale of captives. Certain African nations like Igala, Kabu, Bono State, Oyo, Ashanti, Dahomey, and the Oro Confederacy were particularly known for their brutal involvement in the slave trade. While Africans were deeply implicated in the slave trade and contributed to its operations, Europeans played a crucial role by providing economic incentives that perpetuated and expanded the trade. King Afonso I of Congo Zinga famously appealed to King João I of Portugal to cease sending merchandise that fueled intertribal warfare and the capture of his people for enslavement. He advocated instead for the sending of missionaries to his kingdom. His letters poignantly describe the devastating impact of the trade on his people, condemning the widespread kidnapping and enslavement that depopulated his lands. Despite the profound consequences of the transatlantic slave trade, several nations that benefited economically from slavery have issued apologies. In 1998, UNESCO designated August 23 as the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition, sparking global recognition of slavery's adverse effects on Africa. In 2001, at the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, African nations called for formal apologies from former slave trading countries. However, efforts to secure apologies and reparations have faced opposition from nations like the United Kingdom, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States, partly due to concerns over financial liabilities. Since 2009, the United Nations has been working to establish a permanent UN slavery memorial to honor the victims of the Atlantic slave trade. These efforts underscore ongoing global initiatives to acknowledge historical injustices and commemorate the victims of slavery. These efforts to establish memorials and commemorate the victims of the Atlantic slave trade highlight ongoing global initiatives aimed at acknowledging historical injustices. They also underscore the persistent calls for accountability and reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans. The transatlantic slave trade remains a dark chapter in human history, characterized by immense suffering, loss of life, and enduring legacies of economic and social inequality. It profoundly shaped the demographics and cultural landscapes of the Americas and Africa alike, leaving lasting scars that continue to resonate today. While some nations have issued apologies and taken steps towards reconciliation, the debate over reparations remains contentious. Advocates argue that financial compensation is necessary to address the enduring economic disparities and systemic racism stemming from centuries of exploitation and oppression. Opponents often cite practical challenges and the complexities of assigning responsibility and determining appropriate restitution. In recent years, there has been a growing movement for educational initiatives and public awareness campaigns aimed at promoting a more comprehensive understanding of the history and legacy of slavery. These efforts seek to foster dialogue, promote healing, and ensure that the lessons of the past are not forgotten. Ultimately, addressing the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade requires a multifaceted approach that includes acknowledgement, education, commemoration, and meaningful efforts towards justice and reconciliation. It is a complex and ongoing process that continues to shape discussions on race, human rights, and global solidarity in the modern world. If you found this exploration of history insightful, consider subscribing for more content like this. Understanding our past helps us navigate the present and shape a better future together. Thank you for watching.